All right, let's continue with chapter 25. We last talked about Baroque in Northern Europe, with Flanders in particular, and how it was under the Spanish rule, the Spanish kingdom, and that there was an emphasis on the Counter-Reformation, and the paintings and the artwork is reflecting a lot of the Catholic desires. And now what we're going to do is we're going to discuss the Dutch Republic, which is the northern part of Flanders, and how that broke away from the rest of Flanders, like the southern part of Flanders, which was still, like I just said, underneath the Spanish rule. But what's happening with the Dutch Republic, and it formed its name as a Dutch Republic after it became its own region, which is northern Flanders, is it is the reformers, so Protestants, and they're going to be less interested in the elaborate ornamentation and drama that you would see with a lot of the depictions, the biblical depictions of the Catholic Church, and you're going to see more everyday secular-like activities incorporated with some level of religiosity coming from Christian Orthodox belief. When they did separate from Spain, like I mentioned in the last video, is the rule of the area known as the Dutch Republic went to the wealthy merchants. And because of that, a lot of the artwork that was made in this time was part of the vast trading scene that the Northern Flemish were known for, and they were known for vast worldwide trading because of their abilities in the seas. So they were finding their way going all the way around to Japan and Korea and China, and of course over to quote unquote the New World. And their abilities to navigate the seas allowed them to navigate trade very well and made them very, very wealthy. And all of the consumer goods that were part of that trade, there was also the incorporation of the fine arts that were also part of that trade. Now, what's going to happen in the Dutch Republic is an emphasis on a new type of genre, and that is the portraiture genre. So the commissioners of the paintings in particular, now we're going to get into a lot of painting. There's not going to be a lot of sculpture for a while. During this time, it's going to be really much about painting, because painting is something that is a commodity that can easily be transported. It's not super heavy. It's very quick. So a lot of two-dimensional artwork is going to be like the emphasis of the fine arts at this time. So your painting, some prints, like we'll see with Rembrandt, are going to be in high demand. But the portraiture is a new type of genre. Okay, so again, Genre, a new type of genre that's going to be focused on the emphasis of the individual that's being asked to be painted. So portraiture, so portrait. And we'll start with Leicester, figure 25.11, Judith Leicester. And this is her self-portrait. And again, it's the genre painting of portraiture. And she's considered a portraitist. And that genre, as you can see in this painting, this is she, but she's also painting within the painting, and she's doing a portrait painting of a genre scene of a fiddler. So she's painting that of the fiddler who has commissioned her to paint him. I know that's like kind of redundant and very obvious, but this is a new type of painting that wasn't really done that much at this level and at this scale. It used to be done, the portraiture paintings were for kings and all of these individuals that were, running the show and this higher elite. And now the portraiture painting is coming to the middle class, where the everyday person that has a little bit of a disposable income wants a painting of a certain scene or of themselves to be included in their homes, or in an assembly hall, or in a banquet hall, where people commiserate and get together and congregate. So it's less about the paintings of congregation in the church, because if you remember, with the Protestant reformers, they were very austere. They wanted their churches to be bare. They did not want any images of God or of Christ in the churches, because they thought that it would lead to idolatry. So they kept their churches very austere, very simple, and it was all about hearing about God and speaking with God through prayer. So the artwork that was made was often made for people's homes. All right, so that's where this genre portraiture style has come from. It's come from as a derivative of this reformation of the church. All right, so they're like, let's have a photo of a fiddler in my home, or I am a fiddler. Let's have a photo, not a photo, sorry, a painting of myself, and let's get it, into the home. So there's a huge move in painting and prints too in the middle class, and these self-portraits and these portraitures are a big part of that. Leicester is known for having a very accurate touch to the paint, but also leaves room for spontaneity. And the reason that she does that, leaving some of the paint loose, that's what I mean by spontaneity. Like leaving it a little painterly, not like really super sharp, making it a little smudgy, if you will, is that spontaneity she actually learned from her teacher, but it's still very accurate. So to control something that appears spontaneous is really quite a feat in painting, because you could really go wrong very quickly. So you need to have, and you need to know when to have your sharp edges and your sharp contours to create some kind of border around the imagery that you're painting, but you also need to learn how to keep it spontaneous within that border. So it's like controlled chaos, if you will. And she learned that from her teacher. And they even believe that her teacher was the one who originally painted this, but she painted it herself. Ultimately, we figured out, art historians have figured out that she's the one who actually painted this. And the reason that she does it like this spontaneous and this accurate like style combined, this order and this chaos, if you will, is because she wants to invite the viewer to evaluate her technique. And so she placed herself in a painting scene. So she's painting a fiddler, which she's very gracefully looking at you to let you view, and you as the individual have an opportunity to evaluate her painterly style. And by viewing and looking at you again in this portraiture genre, it's the Baroque idea of looking and seeing, meaning that the individuals in the painting are looking at you to engage you on the outside, to look into the painting and see what they're doing. So that's very Baroque, including the outside viewer into the interior narrative of the painting. So she's doing that through this self-portrait. She's having you focus on her first, then having you focus on she as a painter, and then having you focus on one thing that I haven't mentioned is her aristocracy. And by her being relaxed shows her assurance, but also the way in which she's clothed shows her social acclaim and how much acclaim she got as a painter during this time. So what she's wearing is a reflection of her acclaim in society in the Dutch Republic. Right? So it's an intentional desire to show her in this very ornate dress to show how much respect that she received as a painter during this time. Versus Rembrandt would put himself in his painting smocks, like with his apron and everything, and not try to get dressed up in his self-portraits. But she is very dressed up to show her respect for the ones that respect her. Okay, if that makes sense. Yeah, and then again, that Baroque style of including you as the viewer in the activities internally happening in the painting, in and out, you're looking and she's looking at you so that you can see what she's doing. So again, it's very true to that Baroque element that's occurring during this time. All right. But just remember that she is a genre painter, and the genre painting that she's focusing on is the portraiture, as well as the portraiture within this portrait, self-portrait, and that is the fiddler itself. So it's kind of multi-layered portraiture. Okay, so that's Leicester. We're going to talk about Rembrandt, and then we're going to talk about Vermeer, and then we'll move into the French elements of Northern Baroque. Okay. So Rembrandt, we're going to start figure 2512, the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp. And Rembrandt, again, like Leicester, is a portraiture painter. So he is going to focus on the everyday folks and how their commissions into these portraiture paintings are going to really be heightened and emphasized during this Dutch Republic time of Baroque. Rembrandt's also known as being a genius of light and shadow, and you can see that he is influenced by Caravaggio, but he's going to do something a little different with the use of light and shadow. And he's going to create kind of obscure light sources. So you're going to have direct light sources upon a certain area in the composition, but then you're going to have an effulgent glow of light around some of the other figures where that light source, you're not quite sure where it's coming from. Like in figure 25.12, anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp, you can see with the two figures in the back, there's this slight, subtle, radiant light that's emitting from behind them. So we're not quite sure where that source comes from. But then we have a direct light source on the cadaver, or the body that's being dissected in the very bottom center, where there's a very bright light source, but we don't know directly from where that's coming from. So there's an obscurity on where the light sources are coming from, but it's creating this compositional genius between a balance of light and shadow and emphasizing certain areas. But still not really knowing in particular where those light sources are coming from. So what is Rembrandt doing here, and what does he do very well? First of all, you got to remember that these are portraiture paintings. All right, these are portraits, and in this case, he's clustering his subjects in one area. So he's not spreading them across the canvas like you would see with past Flemish painters. If you remember, even with Rubens in the southern Flanders area that we just looked at in the last videos, the figures are spread throughout the whole canvas. They're everywhere. And if you remember what that is, that Northern European technique, it's the horror vacui, being afraid of empty space. And what Rembrandt is doing is not being afraid of empty space. He's clustering all of these attendants at this anatomy lesson to the center and then to the left. And he's leaving empty space over to the right behind Dr. Tulp. All right? So there's an emphasis on having them clustered in one area. So he's creating a new type of composition on shifting the activity and leaving this quiet space alone, which is something that is not very common with the Northern European painters, especially during a Baroque time when everything is just so animated and full. But he's clustering them in one area, which is a new kind of genius to portraiture painting. Right? Typically, portraiture painting is laid out from left to right, top to bottom, everything centralized. Here, as a portrait of these attendees and the doctor, it's all shifted to the center and to the left of center. All right? And the cadaver itself is at a diagonal. It is foreshortened, which is something that's not typical with portraiture painting either. Typically, everything's on a horizontal plane. And then here, it's at a diagonal, and the feet of the cadaver are pointing at the anatomy book, which is really the only activity that's happening over to the right, is the feet of the cadaver at resting at the anatomy book, which is just there. So everything to the right is at rest, and everything to the left is contrasted with heightened activity of paying attention, or even not paying attention with some of the figures that are looking away. So he's balancing out the painting by having motion, implied motion, and curiosity in the attendants to the left, and then peace and calm to the right, with not much going on. And the shadows are in the place where there's not a lot of activity, and then the light is in the place where there is a lot of activity. So that's what makes him a genius of light and shadow. So yeah, there's the diagonal placement of the body, which is a very untraditional portrait. And then also he creates a triangulated composition with the figures that are clustered there to the left center. Right? And that's something that he learned from Renaissance painters like Leonardo and Raphael. So Leonardo created a pyramidal composition with Madonna and the Rocks, and he learned from that. So you got to remember that these Northern European painters during the Baroque period were in Italy studying from time to time during the classical Renaissance time, and then also the Italian Baroque time. And they're taking these techniques and they're applying them to this new age. And then with Raphael, it was literally the triangular composition in Madonna in the Meadows. So Rembrandt is taking that compositional technique, that rational kind of compositional technique, which was very classical and Renaissance, and he's bringing it into this Baroque painting. So he's combining that with his own techniques, as well as kind of the anti-Baroque like style, where it's super clustered and very active in one area, but then in another area it's very quiet. Okay, so that's anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp. Now let's take a look at one more, and that's the Night Watch. And some of the same techniques are applied here. You have a quiet space up top above all of these individuals, and then you have a heightened level of clustering in the center to the left, but you have a smaller amount or a less amount of clustering of people to the far right. So again, and based off of the shadows and the light is where you emphasize these focal points. You have heavy shadows in this very quiet space up above in front of this assembly hall, but then you have a lot of heightened light, highlighted activities in the front, and then it becomes more subtle to the back right. So again, that is an example of his genius using light and shadow. And another thing that Rembrandt did versus his counterparts whenever it came to portraiture, and I should say that right now, that this is again another portrait. Everything that we pretty much see with Rembrandt, at least with his paintings, is going to be a portrait, so the genre of portraiture. One thing that he does versus his counterparts is he shows amplified energy and complexity and action. A portrait is often known as being at rest. The figure sits there for hours and hours and hours and someone paints you, right? That's at rest. But what Rembrandt does is he shows the ones that are commissioning him for the portrait in action, their amplified energy. So you see here with this company of Captain Franz Banning is they're on the move. And that is something that is very new, a new invention whenever it comes to portraiture. And one thing I do want to say, though that this is called a night watch, it is not a night scene, though it appears that way with the darkness. But the reason why it's so dark is because Rembrandt was playing around with a new type of varnish whenever he was painting, and that varnish created better shadow for him. So that genius of him playing with shadow and light is emphasized with the technical use of this new type of varnish. But unfortunately, over time, that varnish has darkened. And it's made this painting much, much darker than it originally was, according to the art restoration teams that have overseen this painting. The chemical analysis of the varnish has proved that it has darkened over the time that it actually has been found, which leads them to believe through deduction that from when it was painted all the way up until the painting was found and restored, that they realized that this has been a reoccurring thing since that varnish has been placed on that painting. So that's why it looks so dark. So the varnish darkened it over time. It actually was a much brighter scene, though he did use that varnish to create darker shadows, okay, and that contrast between light and dark. One thing that is very enigmatic about this painting is the glowing woman figure in the center left. Still to this day, we don't know who that is. And what's very interesting is that it reflects one of the main figures there to the center right. You have this yellow-like lustrous glow, and we still don't know why, but it really emphasizes that area of the painting. It balances out all of the darker colors to the far right with this bright yellowish lustrous effulgent glow to the center left. So we don't know if it was an intentional use of trying to balance out the composition to create some kind of hidden formulated scale, because if you look at the yellow of the figure in the middle right and then her glow to the middle left, it creates almost this depth, this triangulated depth, and this line that takes you back to the left. And then all the sticks that you see to the right are kind of taking you back to the right. So it kind of creates this hidden like obtuse triangular like shape. So again, we're not quite sure, but she is there and she is grounding the painting quite nicely. She's kind of keeping it fluid. She's making it fluid. And he wanted to show portraiture as fun. So this is not actually a night watch. They're actually on their way to a parade. They're getting ready to parade. So he wants to show these commanding individuals like Captain Franz and the other musketeers. He wants to show them in life and action and in fun and in jovialness, not just in seriousness. He wants to show them as a fun kind of group of folks. And so he wanted to kind of enliven it by showing this excitement and frantic activity. All right, they're all kind of like getting everything together. They're getting ready to prepare the drum. They're getting ready to take their musketeer sticks and move forward. And he wanted to animate and enliven the portrait, which is something that's very counter to kind of the conventional stoic look of a portraiture. So that's another emphasis on the narrative of the importance of portrait that he is doing. So let's now take a look real quick at Rembrandt's printmaking. So he's not just a painter, he's also a printmaker. And you can take a look and see what Rembrandt looks like. Figure 25.15 as well as 25.15a. Those are self-portraits where you can see they're very conventional, very stoic. So he can do it, and he did those self-portraits to show that he is capable of doing a conventional self-portrait if that's what somebody wanted. But one of his big commissioners like Night Watch, he really wanted to show activity and excitement. So he wanted to kind of play with both, the contrast of the both. All right, so figure 25.16, Christ with the sick around him. So he is known for his printmaking, all right, and he did very well with printmaking. Now, one thing, what we talked about with Dürer a couple of chapters back, and how he invented or how he used the engraving technique to really promote his artwork, and he was able to get prints out to individuals that couldn't afford the paintings, and most of his paintings were for books. And Rembrandt did the same thing. He was able to make these singular prints and get them out to folks that wanted them in their homes, and often they were more religious themes in the prints because people wanted images and activities and narrations of the Bible in their homes. All right, they wanted to be able to look at them, refer to them in preparation before going to church and learning about them from the Bible. So one thing that Rembrandt did that was a little different than Dürer and some of his predecessors in printmaking is he was doing a technique called etching versus engraving. And if you remember what engraving was, is taking that burr-in tool and cutting into the metal copper or zinc plate, and wherever you cut deep into the plate, it gave a really dark black line that the ink got into, and if you barely scratched the surface, it was a very fine, more gray line on the print. But what Rembrandt did is he would take that copper plate and then he would coat it with a wax or some kind of encaustic material that's wax based. Then that would dry, and then he would come in with a tool and then he would carve into the wax and not the metal. And that technique is what started the etching, so an etching print. So, and he would use that etching technique in combination with engraving. And that's what we see here in Christ with the sick. So the darker, more dramatic lines that we see to the far right of this print are more of your engraved techniques where you had to cut deep into the metal to get those really dark colors. And then excuse me, then to the far left you can see it's more of a subtle outline contour of the figures in the light, and that's from the etching technique where he's just scratched the wax or the encaustic material that's on the surface of the plate. And he would reuse the plate, which is something that wasn't very common either. A lot of the printers would use a plate for one edition or one type of print and not reuse them. They would get another piece of metal and they would do a new one. Here, he would wipe it down, clean it, cut it, put the wax on it, etch into it, and he would use that plate for a multitude of purposes and a multitude of layering. And by doing that, it gave it this smoky, shadowy like emotion. And you can see that in the environment, the darker environment that is surrounding Jesus there in the center, down to the bottom right as it curves back down and around up to the figures to the left. By utilizing the plate in multiple layering scenarios with engraving and etching, it's able to get this kind of emotion to it based off of this smokiness. And a lot of printmakers today refer to these type of prints from Rembrandt as avenues of exploration with their own contemporary techniques. And I'm sure we're going to be looking at a few of those later in this class, further down the road into the chapters. So we talked about how he put the wax onto the copper and then cut into the wax, and that's the etching versus the engraving. The engraving is cutting directly into the metal. He would rework these plates, which was very uncommon. And he was a reformer, so he was a Protestant. So he wanted to show with the narrative here with Jesus, with humanity and humility versus the Catholic Church, which would also have heavy ornamentation and lots of levels of symbolism. But here it was very much just about showing Jesus centered, and he's blessing and healing people at the same time. And he's also telling the rich at this time in this image that all your wealth should be given to the poor. So humility, right, as well as humanity. So that was very much about the Protestants and the Reformers, is showing Jesus as this humanitarian, and as well as and emphasizing humility versus being up and above the everyday people, which is what the Catholic Church would often do. And that shift that I talked about from the shadows to the right to the outlines of the figures to the left, that's called a tonal shift. T-O-N-A-L, a tonal shift from shadow to light. Okay, so know that. And just to break it down again real quick, the far left, they look more outlined and they're more in the light, which is the highlighted tone. And then the figures to the far right are in shadows, which is a darker tone. And then Jesus in the center is very pivotal in that by using the etching and the engraving technique, he combined them with Jesus. To the far right, he used more engraving. To the far left, he used more etching. But with Jesus, he combined the etching and the engraving, making it a technical pivotal point to the composition, but also an emotional pivotal point to the composition, by giving a slight amount of smokiness around the contour of Jesus, but then the texture and the detail within his embodiment and the effulgence of his halo is more of a deeper engraved technique, which gives more definition and detail to him. So it's not just a technical balance of the two, engraving and etching, but also using that to pivotally centralize Jesus by him being the combination of the two, very much like he's the combination of the spiritual and the material. So that is the reason why he did that. Let's see, what is our time? Okay, we're going to have to stop with that, and I'll finish with Vermeer, with the Dutch Republic, and then talk about France real quick in the third video, and that will be the rest of chapter 25.